This week, we're going to look at Christian architecture leading up to the Reformation. And I'm kind of offering that as a breaking point because the Protestant Reformation did significantly impact Christian architecture. So we'll look at the origins of earliest Christian architecture up through the Middle Ages. And then in class, we'll do a little more return to Gothic architecture in particular and look at an example together. So let's jump in. And I suppose I should say too that this lecture and then the Christian architecture post-Reformation, probably this lecture in particular, because I'm a medievalist and this is my area, so this is going to be the lecture that will probably run over time. So apologies in advance for that. All right, but what do we have for sources and evidence on early Christian worship? Not a lot of great material, not a lot of great sources, or not very thorough sources. Obviously, part of this has to do with as the Christian religion is emerging in the first few centuries CE. They're a minority religion. They're also suffering occasional bouts of persecution. So, writing things down and kind of codifying things is not their top priority. And a lot of what we do see in the second bullet point there is that some aspects of liturgy or worship are alluded to in the surviving text that we have. Meaning that, of course, if you're writing within a community, there's an assumption, right? You don't need to set out or explain unless there's like a correction or an instruction or something like that happening, right? So that's for the first century or so, we do have some of those aspects alluded to. Where early Christian worship is happening, and here I'm just talking in that first or second generation of Christianity, in domestic spaces, so in homes. And this includes liturgies, which we'll look at. We'll return to Dura Europos in our lecture today. Also, in the very earliest Christian communities, they're still going to the temple in Jerusalem, and they're also meeting in synagogues, going to synagogues. So there's this relatively brief period of overlap, and then as Christianity and Judaism officially break apart from each other, Christian worship retains some of the elements, kind of the framework from worship in the temple and teaching in the synagogue and so on. Okay, so some of the references that we do have and some of the liturgical calendar, like I said, is retained, although modified or adapted, kind of transformed by Christians. So the idea of the Lord's Day, over time, this shifts from the Sabbath on Saturday to Sunday. And then some Jewish festivals are retained in Christian celebration too. So Pentecost, which means the 50th day, is still a Jewish festival, but in Christianity it refers to this account of the Holy Spirit coming down upon the disciples and the Virgin Mary. So anyway, so some retention of these practices. We also get in the New Testament texts some allusion to and description of people in leadership. In the earliest Christian communities, leadership is often the people whose homes are being used, and that includes women. There are references in the New Testament to names of women whose homes they were meeting in. So kind of the hosts had kind of leadership roles. And then there were also from early on appointed leaders. And we get, there's a list of just some of the types of terms that are used in the New Testament. So it seems like they're understanding that there are distinct roles for folks in the church. And women are a part of this, are a part of the early Christian movement. There are a lot of unnamed women in both the Hebrew Bible and New Testament, of course, but there are actually quite a lot of women named, oops, I forgot one reference there, a lot of women named by Paul and others in the New Testament. I'm not gonna get into Paul on women, but I'll just say that he seems to contradict himself sometimes in his positions, and remembering that letters are to specific communities, right? So there's different contexts, but I'm not, we won't get into that. We can talk about that in class, but we know that women were in leadership immediately. We know that women were hosting, meetings and worship. And we know that there were female deacons from early on too, and that they assisted in baptism as one of their functions. What exactly does worship consist of, or the liturgy? Liturgy being the Greek word work of the people, which refers to a kind of order of worship. So what does liturgy consist of in the early church? There are some kinds of declarations of faith. This will become codified in the 4th century, officially in an ecumenical, that is in a universal council, the Council of Nicaea. But there were already, the creed that's issued at the Council of Nicaea was already being used probably as a creed in baptismal services in Jerusalem. So we know that there are kind of creedal formulas that are being used in various Christian communities. There are hymns that are being sung together, maybe prophecy or kind of declarations, prayers to God in Jesus' name. These are things that were, in the New Testament, NT standing for New Testament. I don't know why I didn't write that out. Readings of scripture, public readings of scripture. So at this point, in the 1st century or so of Christianity, that would not be the New Testament text, but rather the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So especially the Psalms, but also, the prophets and so on. So then there would be exposition or teaching on those scriptures. Paul, mentioned speaking in tongues. There's some kind of prophetic declaration, a meal together. We'll come back to that in a second. But sacraments, so baptism being one of them. Also imposition of hands, which is something that happens in baptism, that means laying on of hands and kind of in prayer. Healing, ordination, a granting of authority, gift giving. So that might be financial gift giving, but also bringing the bread to be used in communion, to give liturgical objects, things like that. Healing, which includes, or in the ancient mind is also casting out demons, and then anointing, which can be tied to healing, can be tied to ordination, baptism, so on. And so then olive oil would be used in that case. Okay. I'm putting these up mostly as references. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we have, again, in the New Testament, some references to some of these actual texts that are being used, right? So kind of an obvious one is the Lord's Prayer, which is recorded in the New Testament and to this day in Christian communities is still recited in churches. There's also, hymns, the Sanctus, Holy, 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 different benedictions, go in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, kind of thing. And then different canticles. So those are kind of individual songs. For example, the Song of Simeon. This is when at the presentation of baby Jesus at the temple by the Virgin Mary and Joseph. And Simeon says, basically, I can die now. I've seen the Lord. I don't know why I brought that up. Oh, because we still use that in the Orthodox liturgy. That's a very common one. So, and then the meal, so to return to the meal. In the earliest Christian churches, so the first couple of generations of Christianity, the first century or so of Christianity, it's a little ambiguous about what the meal is and what it means to people. And it seems, well, actually, we know that there are multiple kinds of meals that would happen together. So one would be communion, a kind of ritual of the bread and the wine, as instituted by Jesus at the Last Supper. But we also know that there's what are called like agape meals, or, community, just community meals, so that people would come back together and eat as a community. And has reference maybe or emerged from the Jewish Passover meal. But it's clear that early Christians are thinking about things differently and trying to figure out who this Jesus guy is and stuff. So for the Eucharist or the meal, it's understood as sacrifice, as a kind of thanksgiving that has origins in Jewish worship. Memorial aspects. Jesus said at the Last Supper, "Do this in memory of me, in remembrance of me." A covenant with God, communion. I mean, that's what we refer to communion. We refer to the Eucharist as communion, and maybe don't think about what it means, right? But it is corporate. So it's something that is making a statement about, by participating in the Eucharist and communion, you're making a statement about your relationship to that community. So it's not an individual, I'm going up there and having communion, just me, myself, and God. But you are doing it with a community. So it's also a declaration on kind of a horizontal level. And then eschatological banquet. So a kind of, well, just is what it is. Thinking about kind of cosmic time, right? The idea of like a sacred time that is collapsing the future and the present in some ways. Okay. The image back here in the background is from the one of the catacombs in Rome, and it's an image of Jesus as a philosopher flanked by the disciples, just FYI. So in addition to the New Testament texts, we also have a lot of other 2nd and 3rd century texts that talk about the liturgy. Often you can see a lot of these are, well, some of these I don't list the actual text, a lot of the times in letters. So again, there's a lot of assumption. It doesn't give us historians a full picture, but we get little glimpses of how they're being, how they view themselves, what they're concerned with. Pliny is not a Christian. He's writing to the Emperor Trajan about Christians. So that also gives us an interesting look at how the early Christians are being viewed. So I'm not going to, you can see liturgy is a really complicated thing, even in the modern era when you have lots of sources. But in the pre-modern era, even as they're trying to kind of have consistent practice throughout the Christian community in the Mediterranean world, it's very regional. And so it emerges and changes in different ways. I can talk more about that in class, but we're going to focus on the architecture right now. So like I said, we're going to go back to Dura Europos. Remember that's the Roman outpost, kind of really at the edge of the Roman Empire in the mid 3rd century. And we looked at the synagogue. We're going to return now to look at the house church. So that's here on the western wall. And here's the footprint of the church. So remember this image here on the left kind of flips from that previous. So the Euphrates is here, bluffs all the way around, and then that western wall that was attacked and that they had to fill in, tried to reinforce it to keep off attack. So here's the house church. You can see, I'll have some more images in a second. This is the footprint. And it is a house church in the literal sense that it is a house that has been turned into a church. So it's not a house church in the sense of a bunch of people sitting around a living room playing guitar, which maybe some of you who are Christian identifying have experienced that in some way. This is a house that was literally turned into a church for liturgical use. So it's a Roman domus, which means it's a kind of usual square layout. It has an open atrium in the center. You'd come in off the street. And here's the room we're going to be focusing on because it has, well, it's the best surviving. Here's a little recreation. So entrance over here, you have the courtyard. There's also a room right there. And archaeologists have found evidence that there was a wall here that the community knocked down in order to make a bigger assembly room. So this is where liturgy would happen, or communion would happen. And then in this little room is the baptistry, which is what we're going to look at. And for those of you who have been in my art history class, you're familiar with this. So you can see maybe how much you remember. It can be a refresher. This is what the baptistry looked like when the site was discovered by British soldiers in 1920. So you can see the conservation is an issue. It's great that it's preserved, but the frescoes and the wall paintings in particular are not in great shape. This is a previous installation at Yale University. You can see based on the carpet, probably dating to the 60s or 70s, or at least that carpet dates then. The last time I was at Yale, this was not on display. I don't know what the current status of it is. But this tub, which is, you can see plaster, so recreation. So it's the little arch here is original, and then they've kind of filled things in. So they have parts of the wall paintings, a little bit of the ceiling, so on. So it's about 4 feet by 3 feet. So it's not something that you could lay down in. You could kind of sit in, and then, so it's kind of a combination of immersion and sprinkling. So this site is significant for us because it is the oldest surviving baptistry that we have. Obviously, the font part is not totally surviving, but we have part of it, right? So at this point in Christian history, adult baptism would be primarily, or baptism would be primarily of adults. You know, because it's mostly adult converts at this point. And then as people are, you know, as you have Christian families and people being born into the church, there are more and more, by the time of Augustine, more and more infant baptisms and child baptisms. But for adults, it means that they would be catechumens, that is, their kind of prospects. They'd be catechumens for several years. So they would undergo, well, teaching, instruction, but they would also be watched, you know, I mean, not watched, not like spied on or anything like that, but observed, you know, and to make sure the process would take several years. They want to ensure that, you know, they're not still sacrificing at the temple of Jupiter down the street. They want to make sure that they're not going to rat on them or hand over, you know, documents or something like that to the empire, and so on. Just make sure that they understand what they're getting into and that they're serious and all that kind of thing. So baptism would usually happen at night on the Saturday night before Easter. So it's a part of Lent as well. And that's still the case in the Orthodox Church, not exclusively. People get baptized all year round. But it's especially common that a catechumen will kind of, and it's still sometimes a multi-year process actually in the Orthodox Church, that a catechumen will be received into the church around Easter. They probably would not have been allowed into the baptistry before that. And they also would not have participated in the Eucharist. I mean, they definitely wouldn't have participated in the Eucharist. They wouldn't have even been in the room for liturgy. And we'll come back to that in a second. So on the Saturday night, they would come into the baptistry for the first time. They'd be ordered to strip naked. And this is where female deacons come in, deaconesses, helpful to have in that instance. So they'd be ordered to strip naked, they would be anointed with oil, and then they would be submerged in the bath. And then, of course, there's the liturgy, there's text that accompanies this. One of those texts being Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters," something like that. So the images reflect this, and we're not in my art history class, so I'm going to not get into the images too much. We're looking at the structures. But I'll just say briefly that the images in the structure reinforce the liturgy. So there's an image of Peter walking on the water, Jesus, so miraculous images, images of faith. There's a healing here. And then the good shepherd is, or a shepherd, terrible image, I know, depicted over the font directly. And there's a little, I think I have my, a little image of Adam and Eve down here. So reference to the fall, to original sin. Well, this is pre-Augustine, so there's not that's explicit doctrine at this point. But we have a shepherd and some rams here. Michael Peppard, an art historian, believes that there was maybe a body of water depicted here. So in other words, that the images in this little room, and they're images that wrapped all the way around, and we have fragments of them, reinforce what's happening in the liturgy. So themes of water. Here over the arch, you have grains and grapes and so on. So like maybe a Eucharistic kind of reference there to bread and wine. The art is, and you can think of that, how dramatic that experience might have been, you know, this rite of initiation that really is kind of shrouded in mystery. The person is anticipating, they have been taught, you know, catechumens knew about the, like the symbolism of baptism, but they haven't maybe witnessed it. So it would be kind of dramatic, and you have this room full of images that are maybe things that you've been taught about, miracles you've heard preached on, and so on. And what I mean by art collapsing time is that kind of idea of like a cloud of witnesses or saints. And so that especially develops more in the later Middle Ages as churches have more extensive decorative programs. Oh, one more thing I want to say here, though, is that after the baptism, then the catechumen, well, then the initiate, new Christian, would be led back into the assembly room to have communion with the entire community. This would be their first communion, and they would have bread and wine. Previously, and they would also have some milk and honey often, so a symbol of both the promised land and also a kind of spiritual baby food. But this would also be their first time participating in the Eucharist and even witnessing the Eucharist, because there was a part of the liturgy, and this is the case for several centuries, where the deacons would say right before communion, the doors, let the catechumens depart, let none of the catechumens remain. And in fact, that's still in the Orthodox liturgy today, even though we don't make people leave during the Eucharist, but it's just retained as part of that tradition. So they would leave at that point, probably for instruction, actually, while everybody else participated in communion. So it's not like it's a super secret society. It's also just practical, you know, for those people who haven't officially joined the community. They're going to go receive instruction while we have communion, and then so on. Okay, we got a lot to cover, so I better move on. The major shift, and one of the most important events in the history of Christian architecture and in Christian art, and indeed in Christianity, period, is the conversion of Constantine, who was a Roman emperor in the early 4th century, or what's known as the conversion of Constantine. That's a whole nother messy thing too that we don't have time to get into. But for the time being, and you can learn more about this in historical theology and or my art history class, but for the time being, we'll just say that he was a Roman emperor who had a vision, and won a vision which God spoke to him, and he won this important battle, defeating his co-emperor, And that's at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge against Maxentius. And then a year later, along with another co-emperor, there were four, the tetrarchs. Again, we don't need to get into that for the purposes of our class. But in the Edict of Milan, legalized Christianity and some other minority religions in the Roman Empire. So this did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It just legalized it, and it also dictated that property and scriptures that had been confiscated should be returned, and if it wasn't possible to return property, that Christians should be reimbursed. So they were no longer allowed to be persecuted. Constantine himself, his conversion is, we could kind of say conversion in scare quotes. He continued to venerate the sun god Sol Invictus. His mother Helena was an early convert to Christianity and went on a kind of pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And she and Constantine funded building programs throughout in the Holy Land and in Italy. So we're going to look at just a couple of them very briefly. So as Christianity becomes not only legalized, but then imperially endorsed, the emperor offers to build the Christians their own worship space, their own temple, right? Well, the early Christian community is very concerned with separating themselves, distinguishing themselves from their pagan contemporaries. And side note here, pagan is also not a very helpful word. It's a word that terms developed by Christians in a Christian context, right? So it's kind of a in some ways like a Christian-centric word. But anyway, we can also talk about that more later. But we'll just say for those, they're distinguishing themselves from their polytheistic contemporaries. And so they did not want something that looked like a temple. So what they ended up landing on or deciding to use was the Roman basilica, which was a civic building. So we think of a basilica as a church now. The basilica is actually a civic building. It's the kind of place where you could go hire a notary public or a lawyer or something like that. So you're seeing the remains of a basilica of Maxentius and Constantine that was actually built, well, it was being built before Constantine defeated Maxentius and beheaded him. And so it was oriented the wide way. And you think of civic buildings that, the state capitol building, things like that. It's a wide orientation. Here's a computer-generated kind of reconstruction. Marble revetments. Those are the decorative, thinly sliced marble that creates these kind of beautiful mirroring patterns. A coffered ceiling where it's kind of, that's decorative and also functional because it's removing some of the material, which makes it lighter weight, right? And you can see it has, so it's huge, obviously. What we're looking at is an apse, so that's a semicircular part of the building, opening in the building. That's good for acoustics. Here, the person who created this mock-up put in the gargantuan statue of Constantine. It maybe there would have been a statue of a deity. Hard to know. But anyways, it doesn't have the religious connotation that that Roman temples had, right? There's the parts of the statue that survive. His knee. Okay, but we're moving on, focusing on architecture. So what the Christians do is they take this basilica floor plan and they basically orient it the other way, because what they need is a place for large gatherings, for teaching, and for processions as the liturgy is developing. And also thinking back to what we talked about with Jewish temple architecture and the tabernacle and this tripartite separation of space, where you have an atrium, a place where bathing could happen, or just greeting, kind of as you're processing into moving into more and more sacred space. The narthex is the entryway, basically the lobby, really the lobby. And then as you move into the church, the nave is the main hall. Often there will be a single or double side aisle. In the later Middle Ages, we get more and more side aisles as populations grow, Christian populations grow, and so on. And then that apse. The apse is a really good acoustic space. So this is where the altar is placed. It's also where, if this was a cathedral, where the bishop would be seated and teach from. Christians also retain the bema, which is that raised platform that we saw in the temple and in the synagogue. So that's an acoustic and visual aid, right? So this is where teaching would happen from, and so on. What else was I going to say there? The apse. Oh, cathedral, that's what it was. So the cathedral, FYI, is a specialist term. It's not referring to an architectural type. So a basilica is a kind of architectural plan. A cathedral is a status term. It means that it's the seat of the bishop. So the word cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, which means chair. So it's the bishop's home church, just side note. Okay, so here we're looking at a basilica plan and a central plan. These are two very common early floor plans in the early Christian church. Later, a transept will be added. That's basically turns this into a cross shape and would be used for more space, sometimes side chapels and things like that, or additional choral space for space for the choir. A central plan is what it sounds like. There's a central dome. You still have those, a nave and side aisles, but it's a squat, it's a square plan. So you have all the same components. Naos is another word for nave. I don't know why they did that like that. Okay. One more thing to note about the apse is that, Christians, again, because they're trying to distinguish themselves from their pagan contemporaries, are not going to put a statue in the apse. But because of the altar, the apse and the altar space are a visual focal point, right? It's a liturgical focal point, a symbolic focal point. And as decoration in these churches develops, that's reinforced by the decoration that happens. So you see usually images of salvation history, often images from the Hebrew Bible, prophets, and so on. And then it all kind of culminates in the apse, where you'll see images of Christ and images from the New Testament, or kind of apocalyptic type images. So what they do is they do something of an innovation, and they take an art form which had previously been on the floor, which is the mosaic, the Roman mosaic, which you find in baths and houses and all kinds of places. And they move it to the wall, and they use it to decorate, especially the apse walls. And when they do that, it means that they can use more precious materials. When a mosaic's on the floor, you can see there is colored stone, but they're not going to use stuff like mother of pearl or gold leaf and things like that. When they move it to the wall, it enables them, because people aren't going to be walking on it, enables them to use more precious materials. And so we have really stunning effects with reflective materials and so on. Okay, but again, got to keep myself on track here. Ha, 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 ha. Okay. Really briefly just going to show you an example, well, two very brief examples, and I'm really not going to spend much time on them because, it's just the earliest basilica floor plans. And actually one of them doesn't exist anymore. So St. John Lateran Church is the first, oh boy, and I didn't circle it, did I? Sorry about that. Oh, funny me. Well, extra points if you can find it on the map, because, oh, here we go. I just found it right here. St. John Lateran in the bottom right. It was the first basilica used for a Christian purpose, as built around 320. As you can see, Renaissance facade. Really the only thing that there's been so many changes made to this that we're really just looking at that floor plan. So you can see that all the components, right? The nave, the apse, the transept, this double side aisles, and ignore everything else basically. It was built in the suburbs at Constantine's stables, which he had built on the grounds of the Lateran family, hence the name St. John Lateran. and that had been on Maxentius's side. So he's, it's kind of an FU to Maxentius, who he defeated. It's fun, right? Religion and politics, always a good time. So that's the interior, which we're going to ignore. This is a reconstruction. All this stuff is later. This is the mosaic is a 19th century renovation of a 13th century mosaic, which replaced the 5th century mosaic, but maybe kept its iconography. So we'll just keep going. Another important thing to note about this site, though, is that the baptistry, there's not just like a little baptismal font, think about Dura Europos that we just looked at, but a separate building, a separate baptistry. At the time, this was the only place to be baptized in Rome. And it set an example. So that was the earliest Christian basilica, St. John Lateran. This is the earliest Christian baptistry, as a structure, not the earliest baptismal font we know, but like the earliest baptistry structure. So it becomes an example for medieval baptistries. It's freestanding. It's next to right next to the church. Again, ignore everything on the inside because it's later. Originally, it was a round structure, but probably in the 5th century, it was turned into an octagon. And that has a significance in Christian kind of numerology. Ambrose and other early Christian writers associate the number 8 with Jesus's resurrection and with rebirth. The world was created and God rested in 7 days. The 8th day then tends to symbolize, like apocalypse, new creation, revelation, that kind of thing. Okie dokie. All right. So also really briefly, St. John, or not St. John, Old St. Peter's. Again, we're ignoring so much here. But this was built in what we're looking at here is Constantine allowed them to, the hippodrome had been on the site, the circus, so where races and different events would happen. The Christians are allowed to tear that down. There's also a cemetery and mausoleum near there. So those were buried, and then St. Peter's was built on top of it in order that St. Peter's tomb, and that's why the location was important, so that St. Peter's tomb could be placed under the altar. And let's see, this is probably what it looked like. So your kind of traditional basilica form here: atrium, courtyard, narthex is the entryway, nave, side aisles, the transept, altar, apse, right? That's the anatomy that we've come to expect. It was probably a timber ceiling and probably had some kind of apse decoration. We don't know. Okay. Another really important look, I'm going to show you an example of a central plan. And so for here, we're going to go to Constantinople. Constantine had made Constantinople, which was previously the city Byzantium, is the capital of the Roman Empire. So we're moving several centuries forward here. Constantine had built a church, Hagia Sophia, that is Holy Wisdom. But nothing remains of the original one that Constantine had built. There was a second one that was built that was destroyed in the Nika riots. The Nika riots occurred in the year 532, in which different political factions, again, I'm trying to skim through a lot of our very interesting historical context and focus on these different architectural types to show you some of the ways that, a church that you would walk in today maintains some of the features and layout design that dates back to the 4th century, right? So I'll just say that the Emperor Justinian, these two groups united. to try and overthrow Justinian. They were pissed off about some political stuff, including taxes, but also that some people in their factions had been sentenced to murder for rioting previously, and so on. So it was a disaster. It was a huge riot. Tens of thousands of people were killed in the rioting, and then also in the Imperial Guard trying to control things. Half the city was destroyed. Hagia Sophia was the second. Hagia Sophia was destroyed. Justinian wanted to flee the city, and his wife Theodora, who is a very fascinating figure, famously said, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." Basically, don't be a coward. You're the emperor. You got to stay here. Go down with the ship. But they survived. And so when the riots were over, the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia was a really important symbolic, actual and symbolic assertion of authority. So it was completed in 537. They had employed over 100 master builders and about something like 10,000 laborers to build it in 5 years. Think about that. That's bonkers. And they used all the best materials. So the porphyry columns were imported from Egypt through Rome. They used ivory and gold, 40,000 pounds of silver for decorations. And it is a design of proportion and a kind of industrial confidence, because it's this huge structure. Okay, so here we're looking at it. You have to ignore the minarets. Those were added 1,000 years later when it was turned into a mosque. So originally it would, be this kind of, like these repeating domes. And these are buttresses that were also added at a later date. So we'll get you to a cutaway. So it's a central plan, has that central dome, but it still has the same features, right, of an atrium. You can see the fountain here. And then the narthex is this structure here. Got a cutaway. There's a different entrance for the emperor. The ambo is distinct from the bema. So an ambo is an even higher raised platform for reading scripture and teaching and so on. So you can see there's the nave. We have side aisles, the apse here. The cathedral would be, or the cathedra, the bishop's chair here, the altar, chancel screen. These are elements that become more and more ornate over time, but initially are pretty simple. So let's see if I can give you a sense of scale. The whole area is 7,500 square meters. And we'll get some interior shots. It's a notoriously difficult building to photograph. So here's in the courtyard and entering the narthex. Here's the narthex. You can see those marble revetments and beautiful patterns. This is kind of a fish eye lens. So it's a little distortive, but I think it does give a sense of like how overwhelming it is to be in the space. I should be a little slower here. I'm pretty sure in Google Earth you can do a fly through on this. There's lots of good resources on that. And so you can, and there's not stairs, but ramps that get you up to the second floor. And look at this, 1,500 years of people walking up these steps. And here's what it would look like from the second floor. The roundels, we'll talk about this in a minute, are added in the 19th century. And you can also see that in the apse, so there's some of the furnishings are from when it was converted into a mosque. So we can talk about those when we talk about mosques. So there's that central dome. And you can see the light coming through here. So this was something that made a big impact on folks. And Procopius of Caesarea, who was a contemporary to Justinian in the 6th century, wrote that the huge spherical dome makes the structure exceptionally beautiful, yet it seems not to rest upon solid masonry, but to cover the space with its gold dome suspended from heaven. So that's that kind of technological innovation that, oh dear, my notes are refreshing, that this structure is so big and expansive. There we go. That it was overwhelming and impressive. So it's 55 meters high and 31 meters wide. And Justinian was, according to tradition, said, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," when it was finished. So referring to the Temple of Solomon. There are 40 windows that go around the dome. You can see there that the width of the wall. Unfortunately, the first dome collapsed. So it had to be, there are lots of earthquakes that happen on the site of Istanbul. It's experienced over 1,000 earthquakes, actually, and it's been severely damaged by 3 of them. So in 558, there was an earthquake and the dome collapsed. And so what the architects did is that they raised the dome actually higher, another 20 feet, and then added that buttressing to the exterior of the building. So if your dome is too, we'll look at this when we look at Romanesque and Gothic architecture, if your dome is too low, it's going to go whoop like that. But if your dome is high enough, that's a technical sound, if your dome is high enough, then it keeps that the weight vertically. And this is the great innovation of the pointed arch. So there's lots of things around the building that allude to this lightness and in which materials seem to defy their materiality. One subtle example of that is in the basket capital, which uses deep undercutting to make it look like it's almost like lace, as opposed to, say, earlier capitals that are very heavy in appearance. Yeah, just briefly, so I mentioned some of those elements are later. So the calligraphy roundels and the dome, the calligraphy in the dome, were added in the mid-19th century when the building was undergoing some renovations as a mosque. So there probably would have been an image of Jesus as Pantocrator holding a book and hand raised, if there was an image, at all. I'm actually, for the sake of time, going to skip that. Well, that's just a seraphim, and the face was covered when it was turned into a mosque. So I guess I didn't skip it. Okay. So we have these, here's I think hopefully helpful anatomy of a floor plan. And that the Basilica floor plan remains the most popular floor plan for churches throughout the Middle Ages, and there's differences in scale. In the Romanesque period, so that's kind of 11th to, actually I have the thing, don't I? 11th, 13th century, yeah, 11th and 12th century Romanesque architecture, and it means Roman-like. So it's characterized by rounded arches, extensive stonework. We get the beginnings of sculpture on the outside of churches. And it's also a period in Europe where pilgrimage, there was an increase in pilgrimage. This is related to things like the Crusades and increased travel in Europe and so on. So an architectural feature that develops is the radiating chapel, because there's increased pilgrimage, and so they want more chapels. See these guys here. And then an innovation that will happen in the Gothic period is that whereas chapels used to be individual rooms, they become incorporated into the space, and we'll return to that idea in a minute. So one example, very briefly, of a Romanesque, see if I just keep saying very briefly, it means that time is on my side, I don't know. An example of a Romanesque church here is the Spire Cathedral. So again, Romanesque church, think rounded arches. This is a church in the German Rhineland. It's made from red sandstone, and it was the burial place of Holy Roman emperors till the 12th century. The earliest form probably had a timber roof, and it's been it's had some renovations at various points, but and here's the east facing side. So this is where the altar is in the apse there. So here's the interior. You can see a very long nave. Actually, for a Romanist church, this is remarkably light because it had this very ambitious height. So these groin vaults, and I'll have a visual for this in a second, but a groin vault is like basically where you take two barrel vaults and jam them together. And so you have this like intersection. So this is one of the, we're right on the cusp of the Gothic. This is one of the most daring kind of constructions of its time and region because of the height of this. So they're achieving in a remarkable height using a rounded arch is what I mean. And so that actually, that actually enabled them to have clear story windows, clear story, meaning like a second story of windows, which lets in a lot of light. Most Romanesque churches wouldn't have that or would have very small lights. And so very small lights, very small windows. And so it'd be considerably darker. This also emphasizes height because you have these columns, a kind of alternating support system here. And so they're continued visually up here. So it kind of emphasizes height. All right, so this is on the cusp of the Gothic, and look how dark actually that apse, that is helpful there because there's very few windows in the apse space. Okay? So it's actually more light in the nave than in the apse. Gothic architecture is a remarkable innovation. There are many aspects of Gothic architecture that already existed, but they kind of come together in this particular time and architectural period. Okay, so things to think when you think Gothic architecture. These are some elements. Like you see, we have a lot of the, all the basic things: the nave, the transept, side aisles, and apse, radiating chapels. So the big thing to think of is the pointed arch. And this allows for thinner walls. It's a better distribution of weight. So higher ceilings, thinner walls, bigger windows. This is really what enables Gothic cathedrals and Gothic churches to be what you think of them as, these kinds of like skyscrapers, medieval skyscrapers. This is the new technology. Ribbed vaults, we'll see that in a minute, but that's in the interior. Piers, the columns that are doing the work here. Flying buttresses, because you have bigger windows and thinner walls, you need them to be buttressed, but they're not going to be buttressed right up against the church, as we saw with Hagia Sophia. They're going to be away from the church walls, and so that's what makes them flying. They're buttressing, but from a distance. And so they, so that they're not obstructing the windows, right? If you can have these fabulous windows, you're not gonna cover them up with buttresses. And it's been said that the skeletal structure of a Gothic cathedral is so important and does so much work that you could take away the walls of a Gothic cathedral and it would stand just with the structure there. And stained glass windows, of course, is what we think of too. So the kind of maybe the first, what we could say is like the first Gothic cathedral, the beginning of this, is the Church of Saint-Denis it's just north of Paris. It was a royal burial place, and it was a special place for kind of medieval French identity because Saint-Denis was the first bishop of Paris, and he was the patron saint of France. This is the site of Charlemagne's coronation as king before he became emperor. And it was also a royal burial place, like I said. So Abbot Suger wanted to, Suger, sorry. There's already a Carolingian church, Carolingian era church there, and he wanted to expand it and hoping that he could kind of make it the spiritual center of France and reinforce the king's authority and so on. So he begins rebuilding it, adds a new west facade and these sculptural portals here, which we don't have time to talk about. But again, you're noticing so this is what we call a tympanum here, this lunette space above the doors, and it's prime real estate for visual theology as people are entering the church. So Suger may have been influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius, and again, we don't really have time to talk about him, but he's a 6th century apophatic or negative theologian, a mystical theologian who's associating light with divinity, among other things. So, Abbot Suger, he is paying attention to, in his renovation, proportions of the church and ascribing symbolic meaning to them. So the proportions of a church should correspond to the ideal of heaven. So looking at the book of Revelation and kind of like the symbolism of the description of the heavenly Jerusalem. Noah's Ark, for example, which is said to be 50 cubits. And so medieval architects and theologians are thinking about those meanings and using them to map out. We'll talk more about the proportion of Gothic cathedrals in class. So they're aiming to achieve heaven on earth, right, in creating these sacred space. So of this building, Abbot Suger writes, whoever thou art, if thou seekest to extol the glory of these doors, marvel not at the gold and the expense, but at the craftsmanship of the work. Bright is the noble work, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten the minds, so that they may travel through the true lights to the true light, where Christ is the true door. In what manner it be inherent in this world, the golden door defines. The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion. So, these are stunning technological achievements, and he's reminding the viewer of them, the visitor to the church, that this is all to bring the mind, and you think of that verticality of the Gothic cathedral, guide the mind to the heavenly, to the divine, through these materials. So the materials are not the end point, but are a way of translating us to the heavenly. And I should try and find anybody could, Google Gothic cathedral and stained glass window, and you could find a video showing the light moving across, right? And so that's what we get a little glimmer of here, the way that the stained glass really paints the walls of the church in a way. And then remember, it's dynamic. The light moves during the course of the day, and so that light will be cast across the building as we orbit the sun. Another thing to note, side note here, is that a lot of the interiors of these churches and the exteriors would be polychrome. So meaning that they would be painted in many very bright colors. So we kind of receive Gothic architecture and sculpture as being sometimes very dark interiors, monochromatic, but many of them would be covered in paintings and wall paintings, and they would be really vividly painted. We're also seeing some of those features that I was talking about. So the pointed arch here, and that one's a little bit, center one's more subtle. So, and here's a little visualization in the upper right-hand corner of what I was talking about in terms of distribution of weight. So keeping that weight vertical means that you can have higher ceilings, higher windows, bigger windows, and so on. The pointed arch was also something that already existed. So that existed in Islamic architecture. I'm trying to think of the date, but I suppose for a few hundred years. Yeah, well, I'll show you the next one too. Sorry, thinking. So it already existed, but it's used to great effect and really intentionally and programmatically in European Gothic architecture. So here's some of the terms that I've mentioned already in passing. So the barrel vault, just like taking that arch and making it three-dimensional, right? Kind of carrying it through like a hallway. A groin vault is the intersection of those things. So you can see, and then a rib vault is with a pointed arch. And then there's often, so you can see the rib vault here, and it looks like ribs, right? So it's, hence the name. And sometimes this tracery or decoration would be, much more elaborate. But this is an early example of a Gothic church. Here's a view of the altar space. So look at how much light there is. And you can contrast, here's some of that painting that I was talking about. Painting with light. And you can also see that there's the ambulatory, the walkway behind the altar there. So another innovation here is the piers, which go from being, just your basic column there, and become more and more ornate. And so by kind of carving them out, there's this illusion, and this is called like a bundled column. There's an illusion that it's actually a bundle of a bunch of thin columns holding it up. So again, it's it's kind of this graceful, illusionistic, thinking about Hagia Sophia and those basket capitals. There's an illusion of height, an emphasis on height, and an illusion of lightness in terms of materiality and not just like visual light. So here's a contrast with a Romanesque church, and looking at the difference between how dark that apse appears and how light this is. And you can even see the width of the walls is much greater as well. Here's the ambulatory. So previously, all these little chapels here, these radiating chapels, would have been separate rooms because you would need the walls to support the weight. But with the pointed arch, they can be open, so it creates a lot more airiness and light. And of course, the stained glass window, which stained glass was a technology that, well, we've had stained glass going back to ancient Egypt, but it was usually used for things like vessels and not for windows. So this develops, in the Gothic period as another way of visual storytelling and decoration, right? Okay, boy, this is a rip-roaring tour. This is my final act here, and we're going to move over to medieval Scandinavia briefly. Because contemporary, we're going to look at a couple of churches that are contemporary to the Gothic cathedral in Western Europe. So a couple of things. So we're looking at like what we call kind of Viking era architecture or art. And the word Viking comes from the word sea warrior. Also has connotations of like raid or military expedition. There's lots of, varying accounts of the etymology of this word. People from the coves is another one, Viking. The word Viking Age was coined in the 19th century. So again, these terms are often, periodization and those kinds of things are, after the fact. So we say Viking Age, but that's kind of misleading because there wasn't, there's not unity across Scandinavia at this time. There's, different, kind of tribes and so on that are communities that are operating. They, many of them have shared Germanic roots. So there is that. It's not that there's nothing in common, but it's just misleading to say something like Viking Age as if there's like one Viking, like one kind of Viking, right? That's, yeah. So, but what we call the Viking Age, because I'm still going to use the word Viking period, so that's what we do. What we refer to as the Viking Age is roughly 8th to 11th century CE. Before this period, Scandinavia was very self-sufficient with farmsteads. There were kind of wealthy chieftains who would operate from central places. So there would be a localized place, and then they would kind of maintain their region, right? And when there were surpluses of agriculture, then they would engage in trading. And they also have specialized craftsmen and so on. So there are trades and not guilds too, not the right word, but there are craftspeople, right? We see this in, you think of like the dig at Sutton Hoo. There's really incredible craftsmanship happening at this time. In the 8th century, what we call the beginning of this Viking period, the 8th century is marked by regular expeditions, we'll call them, by sea, by river. A lot of bridges are built in medieval Europe to prevent, I mean, of course, it's in part for crossing a river, but also to prevent Vikings from coming in by river. So they're going these expeditions, sometimes for trade, often for raiding, out of Scandinavia in the late 8th century. And then it ends, the Viking, so-called Viking period ends with the introduction of Christianity into Scandinavia. So also that introduction of Christianity is, there's not a conversion event. It's a very long, gradual process. So, for example, we know that there are Christians in Scandinavia from the 5th century on. So actually quite early, way before this period, but it's rather intermittent, kind of like in a very scattered way. In the 8th century, in this time of expedition, say, there's increased contact. So Viking era folks are also encountering Christianity in the British Isles, at various places that they're going for trade and for trade and for raid, so say. So in some ways, in that sense, whether it is through trade or raid, in some ways, the Christianization of Scandinavia is embedded in the Europeanization of Scandinavia. So the Scandinavians are encountering continental culture, European culture, and in that, part of that is Christianity. So it's especially, and it's especially influential from England, and British Isles is really one of the primary points of contact. This conversion, there's kind of 3 main stages of the conversion of Scandinavia. So there's that early infiltration, 5th century on. Then there's actual kind of organized mission, 8th century-ish. And then you have organization of a Scandinavian Christian church. And that's really 11th century kind of ending of what we call the Viking Age, or Viking era. So this means that there's organization of parishes in the 12th and 13th centuries. And so this is in Scandinavian history, signaling kind of the end of the Viking Age, the beginning of the Middle Ages in Scandinavia. And there's lots of processes, lots of parallels with the process of Christianization of early Christians, so of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean context. So early Christianization there, Christianization in the British Isles, meaning that visually we see we see evidence of religious syncretism, and also translating Christian theology and Christian stories into the visual iconography that's indigenous to the given group or people. So this looks like insertion of crosses into Norse iconography. We're looking here at the Jelling runestone, for example, the mention of God in inscriptions. Runestones are really fascinating. And here I'm talking outside of my, as you know, my period and my specialty, but runestones in general, well, they're stones with runic inscriptions on them. We're seeing a runic inscription on the left-hand side there. When they have images, they're known as picture stones. So these date primarily to that mission phase, so kind of 8th, 9th, pre-11th century, basically, before we get to the organization phase. And these are kind of, runes are a Germanic alphabet, and they were probably originally painted, rune stones and picture stones were probably originally painted in bright colors, and I have an image for you in a second. The difficulty with the inscriptions is that we really can't take these too literally, in the sense that when they're about Christianity, they seem to often be politically motivated, right? Because Christianity is being accepted for political reasons. So we have some stories of, Viking era leaders going to the British Isles, being baptized, kind of converting to Christianity, and then they come back and just like do what they do, right? So it's like there's kind of political alliances or things that are happening there. That does end up, eventually Scandinavia does become Christianized. Sometimes there's reference to pilgrimage. Here's the inscription on this stone, for example, that says that all the Danes were made Christians. Well, we know how that goes. And runestones often appear in cemeteries. So I show these one just to say this is kind of some early physical markers that we have of Christianity in Scandinavia and that kind of syncretism. But also these are a physical marker on the landscape, right? We're going to look at churches in a minute, but even before what are called stave churches, even before these early Scandinavian churches, we have kind of sacred spaces or Christian, religious markers being left in the landscape, right? In the 11th century, there were more than 1,000 runestones carved in Sweden. And sometimes they were built into the walls then of later medieval churches. So they were incorporated into those churches. So I'll show you these with color in a minute here. So we're looking at Jesus on the right-hand side being depicted in a kind of Byzantine manner in terms of like iconographically, but he's entwined in this double ribbon instead of a cross. So here is a replica that's showing what it might have looked like painted. This is a cruciform halo. Here's another side of it. Again, what it may have looked like painted. It makes it a lot easier to pick out. I mean, the thing that's really great about insular art, right, is these kind of like visual riddles that there are, and they're kind of difficult to pick out the animals and interlacing and so on. So when they're painted, it's a bit easier to find them. All right, so by way of conclusion, let's look at two Scandinavian churches briefly. The first is the Ernst Church, which is on the west coast of Norway. And we see it was built in the 12th century, but it actually preserved its 11th century door. So there was an earlier structure, and this is the door that was from the original structure. So again, wonderful interlacing, and these, here's like a kind of dog-like creature biting this vine and or snake, right? The interior of the church likewise incorporates different styles. Celtic there should kind of be in scare quotes. It's not a really helpful term, but so indigenous styles, but also Romanesque. So we're seeing those rounded arches, right? It's got very smooth, rounded surfaces, and we have some contrast of thick and thin elements. If you look at the railings, and then with these columns, and there's been 19th century conservation, so that's always these darn 19th century people always messing with things. And you can see pretty relatively dark interior. Here there's pews, a pulpit, and then the altar in the back there. Our last, and I should make a comment too about just stave churches in general, excuse me. So the stave church is an original contribution that Scandinavian architecture makes. This is a novel thing to ecclesiastical architecture. The earliest Scandinavian stone churches date to the 12th century. And there's about 1,300 stave churches existed in Norway, we estimate. Only 28 of those survive. Part of this because, of course, they're made from timber, so it's more difficult to preserve them. And there's two methods of timber construction. So there's kind of the log cabin style or these vertical upright plank walls. And they're usually then set into the ground in that way. So there's also even more, they're relatively modest buildings that, or there are other styles that are more modest buildings that use the wattle and daub method. So that's kind of weaving of branches together and then using a kind of plaster material. They'd usually have turf or thatched roofs. It would be a basilica style plan, although on a smaller scale. So four corner staves, hence the name, stave church, support the central roof. And then you have interior posts that would create the effect of having a nave and side aisles and the narthex and the choir and so on, all the aspects that we've talked about. Sometimes there would be actually a rounded apse attached to the choir. And then as you can see in this example, a very steep roofed gallery that goes around the whole building. So that's here. And then sometimes, the interior, the decoration would include crosses as you would expect, but also sometimes dragons on the gables. I can have an example of that, I think, up here. To protect the church from trolls and stuff like that. Fact. So this specific stave church was originally built in 1150, and then it was moved near Bergen in 1879. I have a friend who lives in Bergen, so that's nice. Unfortunately, in the summer of 1992, it was burned down by the musician, or I should say, it was allegedly burned down by the black metal musician Varg Vikernes. So black metal as a genre of music, it's kind of a subgenre of music that is like anti-religious, some often neo-Nazi kind of threads, we'll say. He was found guilty 2 years later of burning down 4 other stave churches, although wasn't convicted of burning down this stave church, although he used an image of this burned down church on the cover of his 1993 EP, which was called Ashes. So I don't know, was that a confession? He served 14 years of a 21-year sentence. He also was convicted of murdering one of his bandmates. And then he changed his name to Louis Cachet and moved to France with his wife and children. So I guess he's doing great now. So it was rebuilt. The church was rebuilt in 1997. So what you're looking at on the left-hand side was the modern reconstruction of what had been a 12th century church. So there's only, and this is also part of why he burnt down a total of 5 churches, part of why we only have 28 surviving stave churches in Norway. But lest we end on a sad note, I just want to note that not all black metal musicians are bad. And so you can check out the vegan black metal chef, Brian Manowitz, who is in Florida and has his own cooking show. Okay, I know that was a lot. That was a very ambitious one. I don't even want to know how long this lecture took. So thanks for hanging in there. And I'm excited for our conversation together this week.